Hello, and welcome to the Journeys of Folco Hornblower, the One Ring 2nd Edition Strider Mode adventure, written and narrated by me, Ryan Hewlett. Book 3, Chapter 2. The late morning autumn sun, now high over the valleys and foothills of the Misty Mountains, blanketed the road with warmth, and after a cold and deep damp, fireless night, was very welcomed by Folco. With Billy at his side, Folco trekked with an increased pace on the great east road towards the River Bruinen. He was surprised at the lack of traffic along the road, even for this time of the year, and wondered what may have kept the regular flow of dwarven and barding traders from the past the Misty Mountains, traveling west and back home eastward. Then the images of the dismembered remains of the dwarven merchants flashed across his mind. A moment of despair came across Folco. Have trolls or other foul beasts claimed this portion of the road and land for themselves? Folco stopped, and halting Billy, clutched his spear harder and looked and listened. He didn't sense anything out of place, and although he continued at a decent pace eastwards along the road, he was now more attentive and aware of his surroundings, keeping an ever-watchful eye for any possible danger. Midday, and therefore lunch, came and went, and shortly thereafter, Folco reached the western bank of the Bruinen. The ford over the river was well sited. A seemingly natural rise in the riverbed provided enough height that during this time of the year, one could easily cross it on foot, horse, or beast-drawn cart. Even for a hobbit, the river came only to his knees, and its highest along the crossing. As he surveyed the banks to the east and west, the high water marks of what he guessed would be the spring runoff. But something was out of place and caught his eye. That the high water mark seemed to have been created not that long ago, maybe less than a month. Maybe the reason for the decreased traffic along the road is due to the inability to cross the river, he thought. And other routes must have been taken to get to the west. Crossing the river with no issue, Folco now looked back westward, across the Bruinen. He hadn't realized the grade with which the road descended towards the river, and he could only imagine how difficult it would be to pull a heavily laden cart full of goods up and over the valley walls of the Bruinen. The section of road he now found himself on ran parallel northward along the banks of the river before turning to the east and up over the eastern slope of the valley. Folco continued along it, and once at the top of the valley, and looking down the river and across the now flat grass and rocky moors, he took a rest for a quick snack, a smoke of his pipe, and Billy grazing in the wild grasses of the highlands. Folco pulled out the letter from Bilbo with the riddle and read it once more. Below the mist of the mountain, clouds of white touching stone. The valley lies below. A river cross you go. Folco, while snacking on some berries, the last of his bread, and drawing on his pipe, he pondered on the words and let his mind wander. Mountains, stone, white, valley, river cross. Folco, quietly and methodically drawing in and blowing smoke from his pipe, panned and stared off into the distance. It was at this time something caught his attention. Off towards the side of the road, which at this point along the eastern section past the river was little more than a well-trodden path of hard-packed ground, he saw a glistening, a sparkle of white. Was it a piece of polished steel, a piece of glass, or a well-polished stone? Folco didn't know. But as the sun moved further past the midpoint of its arc across the sky, the flickering had faded and was seen no more. White touching stone. Could it be that which we seek, Billy? Will the fate of fortune be on our side this day? Let us check it out, shall we? Filled with a rejuvenated sense of hope, Folco cleaned up, and going off the road, proceeded northeast towards where he thought the glistening stone rested. It couldn't have been no more than a couple 100 yards away, but he noticed nothing out of the ordinary from the pale green and yellow grasses, the large gray and weathered boulders that dotted the highlands he found himself on. Nothing seemed to Folco at least capable of producing such a spectacle. as reflecting the sunlight towards him moments earlier. His hope diminished, and he started to question whether he saw what he saw, and if it was just a figment of his imagination, a mirage. He had heard stories from his grandfather that those lost in the wild would see things that were not there, like fresh, clean pools of open water, only to be found later by searching parties to be surrounded by nothing more than dry, barren, and desolate ground, with no water for miles and miles. Fortunately for Folco, he had rationed supplies, so he didn't feel like he would be running out of any so soon. He looked around, taking in as much of the landscape as he could. He gazed and panned his vision from northwest to northeast, and then he spotted it. Obscured by a patch of brush along the sides of a large rocky outcrop, Folco saw a small white-colored stone. "Look, Billy, that's it. White-touching stone. For sure we didn't stop to eat and rest. We would have missed this along the road." Folco ran at a good pace towards his finding. The stone was nothing out of the ordinary, in fact quite ordinary as far as quartz goes. Folco wasn't a miner after all, but what was strange was that despite all the stones throughout the area, this was the only showing of a seemingly polished, milky white stone that he could see. Doubt now crossed his mind. Was this the answer to Bilbo's riddle? He began to look for more rocky outcrops and spotted a handful here and there a fair distance away. From his vantage point, they all looked the same, gray, black, and mostly grass-covered. Then he remembered the second line. The valley lies below. Was it in fact the Bruinen where Rivendell would ultimately lie? Or was there another river, or a waterless valley, that created the hidden lands for the elves? Folco stood on the mound of rocks harboring the quartz. Now he could see from the higher vantage point for miles and miles, and if it not were for his climbing up higher, he would have missed it. Far off to the northwest was a sharp drop-off that signaled the top edges of a deep valley. He took note of the features leading up to where he currently was, and to the edge, and then climbed down to where Billy patiently waited, chewing on some grasses next to the rocks. Folco looked towards the direction of where the valley laid, and slowly nodded his head. He for sure would have missed it if he had not realized the valley existed where it was. Whether naturally created or at the hand of the elves, for Folco knew they could do marvelous wonders outside the realm of mere hobbits, or men for that matter, the land looked continuous and uninterrupted. "I think we found it, Billy, the valley that lies below, or at least I hope so." Folco laughed, Billy neighing in response. The two, unlikely of travelers this far from Bree Hill, now traversing the roadless land northwestward, and after a handful of miles, they reached it, the uppermost edges of the valley created by the waters of the Bruinen. Folco gazed in wonderment at the sight, for he had never seen anything like it around Bree Hill, or even the short time in the Shire. The river lay hundreds of feet below where he stood, carving out its path for what would have been thousands of years, Folco thought. Along the sheer, steep walls of the valley were lines and layers of pine trees, the sweet scent carried by the cool breeze within the valley, up and past Folco's senses. Folco smiled and his hope renewed as he thought the right path to Rivendell was here. But he saw no sign of the failed home of the elves, nor any path down to the valley. Undaunted, he proceeded, following the edge, northeastward. The sun now settled deep into the western sky, and the deep orange and reds now filling the early evening. Finding a suitable place to camp, Folco felt at ease, as if the area had been free of any ill will towards him or Billy, a much different feeling than he had just previously experienced, what seemed like an eternity ago, but was only the previous night. As the sun now settled further below the western horizon, and the moon now crested the peaks of the Misty Mountains to the east, Folco sat and ate, and smoked some old Toby, rested peacefully throughout the night. Like the morning before, the brightness and sudden warmth of the sun as it rose over the peaks of the Misty Mountains, which were now quite visible some 40 or 50 miles away, Folco stood amazed at the mountain range, its snow-capped tops spreading as far as the eyes could see to the north and to the south, like a tall fence made of impenetrable stone. Folco had heard about the Misty Mountains and the lands beyond from the travelers hailing from the dwarven halls of the Iron Mountains and Erebor, of the bardings from Dale and the occasional elf from Mirkwood, But he scarcely could believe those tales he had heard, given the sheer size and the magnitude of the mountains of mist that now lay to the east before his sight. His moment of thought, being lost in the majestic wonder of the misty mountains, was broken by the neighing of Billy, and as he turned around to view his trusted pony, he noticed what seemed Billy was wanting his attention for was another, seemingly out of place, but then again not, a milky white quartz rock, right next to them, at their place of rest. Well, it's almost as if we're being led to Rivendell itself, as it appears we're on the right trail, Billy. Now, let us have a hearty breakfast, and find us more of those rock and hopefully Rivendell before the day's end. Folco kept good track of the days, noting this being the start of the 20th day out of Bree. His pack was much lighter now, with most of his preserves now eating, save for a small piece of jerky, a cracker, and a handful of berries with which he found along the way. Fortunately, he had been able to forage throughout, but he scarcely saw enough game along the road to be of any sustenance, and he dared not stray too far from the road unless it was absolutely necessary for survival. The images of the dwarves continued to weigh heavily on his mind. Then the attack by the Southerners flashed again before his eyes. A moment passed, and the sweet, subtle sense of the pine came across him, and he was reminded what he was doing so far from Bree in the first place, to find Rivendell. Let us go. No time to waste, Billy. We cannot tarry any longer. Folco surveyed the area, and aside from the one whitish-colored rock near him, he saw no other near. Taking in a deep draw of air and slowly letting it out, he proceeded north along the eastern edge of the cliff, leading down to the Bruinen. 2 hours passed, and it was close to midday that he found another white stone along the edge of the drop-off. Folco peered over the edge, and in his amazement he saw it. Not far to the side, a narrow path, not 3 to 4 feet wide, on the side of the valley's eastern wall. Folco saw that the path was infrequently traveled, as debris from the trees and winds blowing over the highlands littered the trail. Fallen rocks from the edges, blown branches, leaves, and grasses all laid about, but the trail appeared well traveled otherwise, and seemed to be quite strong. He looked past into the valley, and he could see the path switch back and forth down, and then behind and then out of sight. The scent of pine now was stronger than before, as scores of old, tall pine grew along the edges of the valley. The river was glistening in the sun, as the water flowed across many rock formations, creating large, impassable rapids. There would be no way for any boat, of men or elf for that matter, that would be able to traverse such a sight, Folco thought. Taking a moment to gather his wits about him, he ensured the gear on Billy's back was secured, and he carefully proceeded down the pathway into the valley below. Folco took his time navigating the narrow path clinging to the valley walls. One false move and both he and Billy would surely fall to the bottom, he thought. 2 hours passed before Folco reached the bend in the path that wrapped around the cliff face and followed the river. As he did, and the majestic sight of what he saw came into view, forced Folco to stand back in awe and wonder. The River Bruinen and the many falls that flowed from either side of the valley glistened with dance-like grace in the mid-afternoon sun. The pine that welcomed Folco at the top was now replaced with a flourishing growth of beech and oak, all different colors of the autumn. A faint sound came over the wind across Folco's ears, a sound of song, light and fair, almost as if the very valley itself was singing a song of peaceful serenity. Folco's mind and heart were at peace. Even the shadow that has been with him since the finding of the silver ring he now wore seemed to fade away. Nestled along the edges and on both sides of the river, houses and structures of elvish make rose up, and the tallest majestically alone like a peak of a mountain. He smiled, and looking at Billy, he led them on. As lateness of the day approached and the sun now setting low and behind the walls of the valley, the long dark shadow of the evening was starting to cast on Rivendell. Folco could scarcely believe his eyes as each of the buildings, the waters, and even the trees themselves seemed to glow a soft, white light, keeping the darkness at bay. Flickers of an orange-red glow he could see coming to light all throughout the buildings that made up Rivendell, as well as what Folco thought was the only way across the river, a lone stone bridge. As Folco drew nearer, a chorus of elves throughout the valley sang in unison, again with a sense of peace and serenity. Falco's heart warmed at what he had so far experienced, never realizing the true wonderment of the majesty of the elves until now. The path that he was on turned the last of the corners. The full view of the bridge now lay before him. 2 large statues of elven warriors of old guarded the narrow stone bridge spanning the Bruinen. On the opposite ends was a circular tower. Folco wondered why no one was out to greet him as of yet. Surely someone must have seen him traverse the distance by now. But no one could be seen. Only the singing and the rushing of the river below Folco heard. He looked around once more, and then, with Billy in tow behind him, walked the narrow bridge across the river. Vertigo washed over Folco, and he questioned his resolve. But he hurried as fast as he could and reached the other side, and walked under the arched opening of the circular tower. Folco relaxed his breathing. He walked onward, and standing in complete awe and wonder, he looked over the entirety of Rivendell. On the lower flats, many elvish buildings rose from the ground, as if planted and grown, almost looking as natural as the pine, beech, and oak of the valley itself. Past these buildings rose a marvelous structure, again seemingly natural to the surroundings. Tall, majestic, with a center spire seemingly reaching for the now emerging stars in the sky. A large circular plaza with a fountain in the center welcomed Folco, as he kept walking towards it without even realizing that he was doing so, lost in the majesty of the place. Folco then saw a figure, a man-elf, tall and graceful, was walking down the set of stone stairs leading down from the main building. Waving his hand in greeting, and then across his chest and bowing his head, the elf spoke. "Greetings and welcome to Imladris. Lord Elrond bids you to join him." With that, he gestures to Folco to proceed up the stairway. Folco, taken aback at the sudden acceptance of his presence and an invite so soon, was seemingly lost for words. Yes, of course. But what of Billy? Yes, Billy. Folco now brushing his hand across Billy's mane. From behind Folco, surprising him in the process, an elf maiden smiled and bowed before Folco, and taking the reins from him, for Billy, walked him towards what Folco could only guess was a stable. Folco was amazed, for even the stable was as elegant as any building he had ever seen. Folco smiled and fixed his garments, and nodding to the elf, still bidding him to walk the steps to the main house, we walked up the stone stairs. As he crested the last step, the wonder of the place was still in full view. Folco was escorted past the elegantly crafted open archway of the front porch, and past an already open heavy wooden door, opening into a long corridor, and then past and further into a great hall. Folco stood and took in the craftsmanship and artistry of the place, never before seeing such a sight. The floor was paved with flagstones from rock unlike what he had ever seen in the valley or the stones above, but of somewhere else entirely. Lanterns hung from the carven wood beams supporting the vaulted ceiling, and between each, along the walls, were banners, flags, and pennants of various colors, crests, and the like. What these represented, Folco did not know, but by the looks of them, all of them were from a time long, long ago. In the center, a large lantern, seemingly out of place, almost dwarven in make, hung from the ceiling, casting a reddish light, making the chamber look like it's deep underneath the earth. And if it weren't for the slight refreshing breeze of the valley outside and the sound of the rushing river, Folco wouldn't have thought he was above the surface. "Welcome, Master Hornblower. It is a pleasure to have you here in my home, Rivendell." Folco turned around, and standing before him, stern yet welcoming, was a tall elf, with a fair face like the other elves he had encountered so far, with dark hair and his garments elegantly majestic to match. "I am Elrond Halfelven. I bid you come. Let us break bread, and tell of your journey here, to the Valley of Imladris." Lord Elrond now motions back out to the main corridor and to the right of the main porch, and towards the great hall. Falco bowed his head before Elrond, and looking towards the screen passage separating the room from the corridor, he walked in. The room was long and much less wide in comparison. A balcony alcove, which now Falco noticed above the entrance, sat a handful of elven minstrels, who began to play and sing for the upcoming meal. The high table stood on a dais at the far end of the room, with two long tables perpendicular to the high table, lined either side of the great room, and a great hearth in the middle that was lit with a fire. Set on the high table was a spread of food and seating for what appears to have been only for Falco, and for Elrond. Led by a female elf, Falco was ushered to take a seat near Elrond. As he walked towards his seating, he gazed in amazement at the intricate tapestry hanging on the wall adjacent to the table, depicting a white ship riding a wave on an immense sea, heading towards what looked like the setting of the sun. A breeze from outside ruffled the tapestry, and to Falco's wonder it almost appeared as if the waves themselves were in motion. As both Falco and Elrond stood next to the table, Elrond bid Falco to sit, and he obliged. A handful of elves came out with baskets of bread, fresh leafy greens, other vegetables, and wine. The minstrels in the alcove at the far end began to play their stringed instruments and sing soft melodies. Elrond, on breaking bread, spoke to Falco. "Now, Falco, what brings you to my home via the Great East Road?" Falco stopped midway into eating a piece of bread, and laying the piece down on his plate, he swallowed what he had already in his mouth, and proceeded to take out the letter from his vest inner pocket. "I was sent by Mr. Bilbo Baggins, I do believe you know him, to deliver this letter to you, Master Elrond, here in Rivendell." Elrond let out an uncharacteristic smile and received the letter now handed over by Falco. Elrond opened the letter, and after a few moments closed it up and laid it down on the opposite side of where Falco sat. Falco nervously was eating some morsels of bread and greens. Falco sensed that Elrond was receptive of the letter, written by Bilbo, but had not yet let on what the contents of the letter said. Elrond continued to eat. "It is customary amongst my kin, both the Bree hobbits, and from what I have witnessed so far in the short travel to the Shire, that conversing is welcomed when enjoying food and drink. Is this customary amongst you and your kin as well, Master Elrond?" Falco, now feeling a little more at ease, surprisingly, Elrond gave a slight smile, and then regained more of his melancholic look. "Well, I tend to let our guests be free, to express themselves as they wish. This is not so with all elves, but feel welcome to speak freely here." Elrond gestured accordingly, and speaking with a slight elvish accent. Falco felt more at ease, and with the demeanor shown by Elrond, he appeared most willing to hear Falco out, whatever that may be. Falco ate another morsel of food, and taking in a fine sip of wine, smiled and nodded. "This is a very fine wine, and robust. Do you make it yourself here in the valley? I don't believe I've ever tasted an elvish wine. No, I don't believe I have. This is quite excellent." Elrond nodded. "Yes, well, I would be very much like to take some home to my parents. I'm sure they would be more than happy to have over a special dinner." Falco now feeling more emboldened as he continued to eat, drink, and talk. "I am sure we can spare some of our wine," Elrond responded. "Now, tell me, what is it that you found below the Shire?" Elrond now looking at Falco suspiciously. Falco half choked on some food when he heard the inquiry, and coughing and taking a sip of wine, responded. "Yes, well, you see, it's a bit of a long story, and, well, I'm sure nothing compares to what you've seen before, but, you see, Falco was lost for words. "We elves do live a long time," Elrond responded rather curtly. Falco nodded and chuckled, and paused, then continued. He restarted to recount the events of his first journey to the Shire, how he came to meet Bilbo, his journey to Banfurlong, the happenings of the Old Forest, in meeting Tom and Goldberry. Falco figured Elrond would have interjected on some of the news, but he remained silent. Falco, unsure if he was listening or paying attention at all, continued and spoke of his intended journey to the Greenfields from Woodhall, but took a stop in Brockenbors to help out in exploring the mines under the hills of Skerry. Upon telling of the nameless creature, Elrond seemed more engaged to the conversation. Falco then proceeded to tell him of the rest of the journey back to Bree. By the time Falco had finished his story, both he and Elrond had finished most of the food. As Falco continued, he pulled out his pipe and was about to clean it when he paused. "It is customary for my kin to partake in some smoking of pipeweed after a fine meal, and such a fine meal it was. May I?" Falco now motioning to light his rose-filled pipe. Elrond nodded. Falco started to clean the inside chamber and the outside of his pipe. "Well, you see, once I was in Bree and a few days had passed, I wrote a letter to Bilbo to help me out. You see..." Falco paused, and laying the pipe down on the table, he put his hands together and was twisting the silver ring he had found around his finger. "You see, I was in need of some information about something, and Bilbo sent me to you. Here, to Rivendell." Elrond took in a deep breath and sat back and straight against the chair. "What did you find, Falco?" Elrond was quick to respond, looking rather curiously at Falco now, more than before. Falco now looked down at the ring on his index finger. The silver-colored ring which he had been twisting, he took off and placed it on the table between himself and Elrond. Elrond looked down at the ring and then at Falco. "May I?" he asked of Falco. Falco nodded rather reluctantly. Yes, of course. That is why I am here, to answer the riddle of this ring. But before you touch it, you must know." "Know of what?" Elrond interrupted. Falco swallowed and let out a long breath before responding. "Well, that there is a dark shadow attached to it, one that has darkened my very being ever since I found it. I don't want to say it's cursed, but what other words are there to explain it? I believe that foul creature, that nameless thing I saw below the hills of Skerry, whatever it was, tainted the very metal and rock with which it was made in its lair. What else could explain this feeling?" Elrond now looked at Falco intently, and then to the ring. Falco now, picking up his pipe again, packing in some old Toby and lighting it, watched closely as Elrond now picked up the ring and was studying it. Whatever darkness that had come over Falco when he put it on, at first, Elrond didn't act as if the same washed over him. Falco studied Elrond as closely as Elrond was studying the ring, half curious, but also half afraid that Elrond would ask Falco to give up for good. Falco saw subtle changes in Elrond's breathing, his facial expressions, even the way he was holding the ring after some time had passed. He placed the ring back on the table. Falco looked at Elrond briefly, and as he reached to pick it up, Falco asked, "What do you make of it? Any information you can tell me about it? I know it's nothing out of the Shire, or Smithies in Bree. Never seen anything of this detail come out of there before. I'm fascinated to know what and where it's from." Elrond pushed back his chair, and then standing, looking intensely at Falco, boldly said, "Come with me." Elrond quickly turned and marched down the steps and into the main floor of the chamber. Falco quickly scrambled and pushed back his chair. Not knowing what to do with his now lit smoking pipe, he emptied the contents in the empty dish before him, and laid it down on the table, and rushed to catch up with Elrond, now leaving the great hall. As Falco passed the upper alcove, the elven maidens stopped their instruments and sung. Passing now through the corridor and into the hall with the glowing red lantern hanging low from the ceiling, Elrond led Falco up to the upper floors and into what later Falco would find out was Elrond's own personal library. We'll continue the journeys of Folco Hornblower next time. If you like the story and the content I'm creating, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Check out the other videos I'm creating called Riddles in the Dark, as I attempt to learn and describe the rules of the One Ring RPG for new players and old of the game. Again, thank you for watching. Cheers.